The Korean American story is a great American story. And today we're going ahead and celebrating the 120th year anniversary of Korean immigration. And it's going to be really awesome in LA to have youth, middle, high school, and college students coming in and having the opportunity to hear from a variety of speakers, including African American speakers, Latin American speakers, and also myself from the Korean American community to talk about our immigration histories and to see the connections, intersections between our own stories. So the learning outcomes that I have for our students will be to talk about the three waves of Korean American immigration to the United States, and then, of course, how that kind of led toward the first Korean American ethnic studies course. I'm not going to play this video, but I'm just reminded of one of the earliest activities that I had my students do, where they had a chance to just begin with their own My Story introductions. And I just found it so powerful as they shared a little bit about why they wanted to take Korean American studies. So in order for the tree to grow tall, you have to know your roots. And so for many Korean Americans, they've never had the opportunity to really look deeply into their own roots for a variety of different reasons. I know for myself, I never had a teacher that looked like me, and I never had the chance to learn about even one Korean American that made a difference for the United States in all my K-12 experience. And I think that might be actually similar for many folks as well, at least not having a chance to learn even about one Korean American that made a difference in the United States. And this is so important because this is a part of knowing your own story and knowing your roots. And I encourage my students actually in my own course to have a chance to get to know their roots by beginning with themselves and beginning with their own families, because their families have stories of resilience as well. This is a picture from actually the state assembly when California Assembly passed ACR 111, which named Korean American Day in California on January the 13th, 2022. And I have a video as well. It's called Did You Know There Was a Korean American Day that I also have posted. So that ACR resolution actually has a lot of whereas. It's almost like a history story if you take a close look at it. And it begins with this. Whereas on January the 13th, 1903, the history of Korean immigration to America began when 102 courageous Korean adults and children landed in the state of Hawaii after venturing across the vast Pacific Ocean aboard the SS Gaelic. And so you can see a picture of the Gaelic here, the 102 first Koreans who crossed the Pacific Ocean. I can imagine leaving their hometowns, how difficult that might be for so many, all the things that they loved. I remember my own father, when coming to the United States in the early 1970s, having like a jar, telling about how he had a jar of like gochujang and a jar of doenjang, because, you know, you would not get that taste of home. And of course, a family's love, because you weren't going to be able to see each other frequently. At that time, plane flights were expensive, but in 1903, I would imagine maybe so much more difficult and challenging. So in that first wave, that the Koreans were invited once again to the United States, similar to Japanese and Chinese, to do the jobs that were so difficult to do, including working in agriculture, mining, and in the case of Koreans in Hawaii, it was sugarcane. And I don't know if that sounds like it's kind of a relaxing kind of job, but it was not easy. For those of you who have had sugarcane, it's like almost like a bamboo pole, and cutting through the bamboo poles all day long in the heat, in the humidity, with spiders and snakes. This is like work that no one wanted to do. That's why they need to recruit laborers from Korea who would be willing to do the work, and from other places that would be willing to work, invited to the United States to work hard to grow the crop. The Immigration, however, Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration from Asia. So there was about 7,000 that came across on boats, and another 1,000 that would come later through picture brides. But after that, Asian American immigration was severely restricted after 1924. And of course, because just even if you look at that Immigration Act, that was where in certain parts of Europe welcome, but in Asia not welcome. You can imagine the kind of, outside of just that law, how much discrimination, prejudice, racial segregation might have been in place at that time. So that might have been some of the challenges for that first wave group. First, you got like uh, in Korea, it's difficult because soon thereafter, that first group of Korean Americans coming to the United States, Korea would become under colonial rule. And it wasn't just any kind of colonial rule, but the kind of colonial rule that would suppress Korean identity. I think even for a lot of like students, college, even adults were asking the question, who am I? And if that identity is being suppressed, how difficult that must have been. And in Korea, that included like language being banned in school, the Korean language, Korean names being changed to Japanese names, Korean land seized to support later the World War II effort, religious activities being suppressed, and Korean people being subjected to forced labor and more that happened in Korea between 1910 to 1945. And then in the United States, however, can you imagine being Korean? But then this is what's happening in Korea. Then are you Korean if this is what's happening in Korea? Is it going to become a different country? Is it Korea? I can just imagine the kind of identity crisis that would cause, like, who am I? And at the same time, not being able to really become American either, because after the Chinese were initially invited to really pave the way for all of America through the railroads, they were excluded in 1882 through the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first act that excludes a group by a specific race. And in addition, in conjunction with that, is not just you can't come from China, but also this idea that you can't become American either. So excluding U.S. citizenship and a pathway for that. And in 1924, it expanded from just folks from China to all over in 1924, all across Asia and some other places as well, making it not possible to come to the United States, and secondly, not being able to become U.S. citizens as well. And then, of course, along with that came a series of laws which then applied to folks who were aliens then ineligible for citizenship, including not being able to buy land and racial segregation and only being able to live in certain spaces and places and be at certain places at certain times and marry, who to love, just so many of those kinds of laws that must have been so difficult for those first Korean Americans. And so when we think about where hate came from in this country toward Asian Americans, like very recently, like for some reason, Asian Americans being targeted, I did not make you sick. This is our home too. I'm not your scapegoat. Some people wonder, where did that hate first come from? And then even if you go back 30 years ago to Saigu, when the civil unrest happened in Koreatown, LA, and I'll be traveling out there today. And so I can imagine the thick black smoke and all the stores, so much loss that happened during that time. I'm sure they're asking the same question, where did that hate come from? And then we can go back to 1882, with Chinese being excluded from this country. This country had invited Chinese to come to the United States, but then had excluded them. And oftentimes it was built on this idea of this persistent foreigner. You could never really be a part of the United States. This yellow peril, there's something dangerous about you. And then those that do come, let's just say they're the model minority, then become pitted against other racial groups to create a wedge between Asian Americans and other groups. So it's sad that this story has happened and then has exacerbated to perpetuate the hate toward Asian Americans. In Orange County, OC Human Relations reported 1,800% increase. And I don't love talking about this, but the reason why I bring it up, because I think telling the story helps to do something about it as well. And that's what the Korean Americans did. And very early on, they strived to just overcome these challenges and survive, right? So they survived through helping each other, like Tosanan Chungho, helping each other, for example, at Pachapa camp, and getting at least some kind of wage, some kind of system, so people from Korea who did not have the command of English when they first came, so they could help one another. one of the Korean values is this idea of jong, this closeness that you have with other Koreans and this desire to help one another. And so he really created these societies to help, and at the same time also helping to free the United States. And what's going to happen is amazing over the next course of the decades, because Korea was not a democracy, but it was actually, more of a monarchy. But then it's going to become one of the greatest democracies on this earth. But at that time, at Dosan Anchang-ho, he is modeling that in his own Korean American community through once again these mutual aid organizations or churches. Sometimes this area was also called Dosan's Republic, where there were representatives and people had a chance to voice their thoughts on how things were going to be in their own community. And then there's other folks in the United States, like Dr. Samy Lee, first Asian American man to win an Olympic gold medal for the United States. That's in and of itself amazing, right? He's also in the Army. He's also an officer in the Army. He's also a medical doctor. And he's also the first man to win back-to-back gold medals in platform Olympic diving. And that's truly remarkable that he was able to do all that in his life. And then, of course, afterwards, continuing to serve his community. It's a great American story. But when you think about how he had to practice his diving because he couldn't swim in the pools like everyone else, one day of the week before the pool got drained, that's the day he got to swim. And a good reminder that for Asian Americans, the Jim Crow laws at that time not only applied to blacks, but also Asian Americans as well. So nonetheless, he has a story of resilience, and he's able to win back-to-back gold medals on an Olympic platform diving nonetheless. I mean, what an amazing story of resilience. Or Colonel Yim Kim. He's the first minority to lead a combat battalion, and he led the 442nd Regiment. Of course, this is the famous 442nd Regiment made up of Japanese Americans, of sons that had been interned in the United States, of mostly two-thirds mostly Japanese Americans born in the United States. When because it was at this time, the same time, some animosity between Korea and Japan, because Korea being colonized, there were some that felt, you know what, Colonel Yim Kim, maybe it would be too difficult to lead a battalion like this. But his life embodies what it means to live in multiracial America. And he's quoted to have said, "I'm an American, and they're American, and we'll fight as Americans." And he was such a hero during World War II and beyond. And once again, all these heroes, they weren't just hero in that one battle, but they continue to live such exemplary lives, which is why this Korean American story is a great American story. Now, the second wave of Korean Americans, this was between 1945 to 1964. So I just mentioned how in the past, there was that exclusion that happened that made it very difficult for anyone additional from Korea to come over. And so it was that very small group. And then, of course, their children that then were born in the United States. And then now the second wave between 1945 to 64. What caused this group? Now, this is where it kind of connects with my own parents' generation. Now, before that would have been my grandparents' generation. She spoke Japanese, actually. And I was wondering, I thought she used to think she was just multicultural, so smart and amazing that she's able to also speak Japanese. But I realized, that was during the time Korea was colonized. So she would have been forced to take on a Japanese name and learn Japanese. And so that's what happened at that time to her. And in the second wave, well, this is when, both my parents were born right before the Korean War. They would be very young. And so my grandparents are just a little bit older than that. My parents, grandparents are survivors of the Korean War, which is amazing. And then at that time, Korea must have been at that time one of the poorest nations in the world after 1953. And so it must have been very difficult for the people that were living there. We saw a lot of interracial marriages at this time. Many Korean immigrants during this period were war brides, women marrying American servicemen who were stationed in South Korea. This is going to pave a pivotal role later down the line, because those Korean women are going to then later in the third wave, you'll see, invite their families to come to the United States as well, starting communities, businesses, grocery stores, restaurant entrepreneurs. And that's the third wave. The third wave is a big change. If you're Korean American, most of us are post 1965. There are some folks that are before 1965, and I've had the privilege of meeting some folks that are in that first wave as well, or they're connected to that first wave, which is really interesting, and I want to get to know their stories more. But most Korean Americans are in this third wave of Korean Americans. And that's because of the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act that plays a significant role in eliminating these discriminated quotas and promoting family reunification. This is the group that my father would be in as well when coming to the United States. So they're the group of professionals, needed professionals, who once again are invited to the United States to work, some students, some entrepreneurs, and then another group which are connected to family reunification. High priority given to folks if they're connected to family members in the United States. More recently, however, has been an increase in H-1B visas for skilled Korean professionals. We have some amazing companies in the United States benefiting both America and Korea: Samsung, Kia, Hyundai. And then we, of course, Korea is a destination station for undergraduates seeking out graduate degrees as well. And then, of course, in Korea itself, since 1950 to, remember how I said how in the 1950s it was maybe one of the poorest countries in the world? Well, now it's probably one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It's in the top 10 GDP of the entire globe. And it's a great democracy story, a great economic story. You can see in this chart here how immigration by Koreans to the United States, or the population of Koreans in the United States, sharply increased in the 1970s and 80s. This is Jeff Kim being born here in the 1970s, right? Not too many Koreans at that time, very few in the United States, which kind of explains my childhood experience a little bit. And then there continues to be an increase in Korean Americans, but not in the same rate as from before. And so early on, perhaps because of the situation happening in Korea, the economic development that wasn't quite as rising as much at the time, a lot of immigration happening in the United States, and then it's decreasing over time. Once again, a reminder that Korean Americans since then have made such great contributions to California and the entire United States in the area of finance, law, medicine, education. And I'm just thinking about myself. It would be in education. It could be in teacher preparation for my father, medicine. And so many Korean Americans have made a great difference in the United States, despite the challenges, including the xenophobia, the language barriers, immigration issues. And the one I want to talk about here is like mental health challenges. This idea that something awesome, awful will happen, or feeling nervous or anxious or depressed, or a little pleasure or interest in things. This is actually very high among Korean Americans, especially, that roughly 1 in 4 experience each of these challenges more than half the time or more. More than 1 in 2 experience at least several days every 2 weeks. So I think this is connected to the triple trauma, the time period when Korea was colonized, the Korean War, the migration. All this has not been really processed very well, I feel, by the community. And there's that pain that's still there, the trauma that's still there. And then, of course, speaking of discrimination and racism, in 2020, we saw the surge in anti-Asian racism. According to OC Human Relations, you see this 1,800% increase in hate incidents motivated by anti-Asian hate. I heard stories of very elderly folks being beaten down and hurt. And then, of course, the 6 women that were shot and murdered in Atlanta. This is when I decided for myself that I couldn't be silent on this anymore, and I had to do something about this. And I asked myself, how can I respond while so many were responding out of fear and anger? And I'm sure many Korean Americans in the past, they were fearful and angry as well. But how can we respond with love and wisdom? Because the great Korean American story, the Korean American story, is a great American story as well. And so that's why in our class, we're having students also know their own stories of resilience. They've created ethnographies of their own families, oral histories. We're going to have a dedication night. I asked the students, how many of you have had a chance to thank your parents for their migration story? And so few had the opportunity to do that. And once again, like I mentioned, there's just so many reasons why that could be the case of triple trauma, the cultural barriers, the language barriers, so many reasons why they haven't. But if I, the teacher, assign the work, I find that students are more inclined to actually engage in these kinds of activities. And I'm expecting a beautiful night where students have a chance to dedicate their ethnographies to their parents and thank them for their migration story of experience. The students will then have a chance to look at this book by Dr. Edward Chang and Carol Park called Korean Americans Concise History, and learn about many other Korean Americans, including the ones I mentioned and the ones that I've not mentioned, and their stories of resilience, because this is going to add to their own story of resilience. They're going to learn about the Korea's resilience as well, the Hallyu movement from 1950 to today. What a great democracy and economic story. They're going to learn about community building, like post-Saigu, even here in K-Town, LA, what happened after this great civil unrest. And what's amazing about Koreans is their resilience. So after experiencing such loss and racism, what was their response? Their response was so beautiful. Their response was to have one of the largest peace rallies this country has ever seen. After experiencing such devastating loss and then creating connections like we're seeing today, even the ripple effect of that 30 years later. And then, of course, us as Korean Americans, second generation Korean Americans, my children, third generation Korean Americans, making a difference for the United States. So it connects to students knowing their story, knowing their own story, having those deep roots, right? Like we talked about, and then telling their story to others. Sometimes when we voice our stories to others, it builds a sense of resilience and agency. Listening to one another's stories with empathy and respect, doing something good with your story. And this doing something good with your story connects to that civic action and learning, doing something out of compassion, doing something with love and wisdom. So I challenge my students, and I challenge all of you listening, if you're inspired by this story, and as you get to know your story and you think about where are your own strengths, what is your story, what is it, something that you're feeling that you need to do, an area that you're like, I want to respond with love and wisdom. What is that area? And what will your story be? We have some great Korean American stories, which are great American stories. And I know your story will be a great story as well as you lean into what it is that you're supposed to do with love and wisdom. This is Dr. Jeff from Ed Family signing out.